First of all, let's start with the umbrella term. Classical conditioning and operant conditioning are both under a term called associative learning. They're called associative learning because if you pull the term apart, it is a process by which we are associating two things together. We are pairing two things together, which will result in learning. What is classical conditioning? Well, classical conditioning is different from operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is done with a series of rewards and punishments, but in psychology, we don't call them rewards, we call them reinforcements. And in my next video, I'm going to explain that even further. Stimulus and response relationship between food and salivating. Now, as I said, this is a biological pairing, right? You have nothing to do with it. It is totally unlearned. You didn't read a book or go to school to learn how to do this. It's unlearned, unconditioned stimulus and response relationship. So we call it US and UR for unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. In this instance, we don't say unlearned, we call it unconditioned. Now, Pavlov was like, how weird can I make this thing? And he could have chosen anything. So that is going to be our neutral stimulus, the sound of this bell. And so when he had rang this bell, he immediately gave the dogs food. And then the dog started to salivate. And then he rang the bell again, and then he immediately gave them food. Then they salivated. And then he rang the bell, and then he gave them food, and then they salivated. And he rang the bell and gave them food, and then the dogs salivated. Until one incredible moment when he rang the bell, but did not introduce any food to them. And what do you think happened? They salivated. The dogs actually salivated to the sound of the bell. This was the new stimulus and response relationship. It was no longer food causing salivation. So this bell is no longer neutral, and the salivating is no longer unlearned or unconditioned. This bell becomes our conditioned stimulus, S for stimulus, and the salivating becomes our conditioned response. This is the new stimulus and response relationship. Eventually, they rang the bell, and no salivating had occurred. The pairing had broke. The stimulus and response pairing had broke. The conditioning had broke. And in that moment is called extinction. When the conditioning is done, it's over. Let's talk about another story I'm sure you've heard. John Watson. John Watson was also in the field of classical conditioning. He didn't use dogs in his experiments. He used orphan children, which at that time was still okay for some reason. What was my unconditioned stimulus and my unconditioned response, and what was my neutral stimulus? Now, I always find it best, and here's my suggestion to you. Start with the response, the unconditioned response. In my story, in the story of Watson and baby Albert, what was the response, the eventual response that we were looking at, that we got from the baby? What was the response from the baby? Crying. Good, good. Now, as I said earlier with the Pavlov and the dogs, we want to try to find what is like the biological automatic response here that is unlearned, unconditioned, 365 out of 365 days out of the year. The baby is always going to cry to this. What is it? Being startled, getting frightened, right? So I'll just write fear here. All right, so that is my unconditioned stimulus, my unconditioned response. No learning necessary. This is always going to happen to a baby every single day of its life, right? So then in this story, what is the neutral stimulus? What previously had nothing to do with fear or crying? The bunny, absolutely. So the bunny at that point in time was neutral to this initial biological relationship. Now, eventually, he had paired the bunny with the very loud sound so many times that the bunny eventually just made the baby cry. At that moment, that's called acquisition because he did not have to make the sound anymore. The bunny was now making the baby cry. This is no longer a neutral stimulus. This becomes my conditioned stimulus. This is no longer the unconditioned response. This becomes my conditioned response. This is the new stimulus and response relationship. That's classical conditioning. That's classical conditioning. Very famously, you might know that Watson then later had introduced things like costume beard, a big white beard, like a white lab rat, and a woman's white fur coat, and anything that was white and furry was making the baby cry is called generalization. All of these things that are not going to make the baby cry, that don't fit the criteria, that's called discrimination. So here's an example I want you to think about. I want you to imagine that you are in class. The teacher is gone for the day and you have a substitute teacher. He teaches around the school. You've never had him. You've never even seen him before. You're doing busy work that your teacher left for you and you and your friend talk a little bit and you giggle a little too loudly, right? right? You laugh at something a little too loudly, and this teacher is not having it. The teacher walks up to you and gets in your face and starts screaming. 3 days later, you're on your way to class. You see that teacher, that substitute teacher, turn the corner and start coming in the opposite direction of you. And as soon as you see that person's face, your heart starts to race. You feel like you're going to have a panic attack. You start perspiring. Here's the question. What was the response here in this situation? It was fear, sweating, right? In this scenario, what is going to get you to panic and have that level of fear? Someone getting in your face and yelling at you. That's my unconditioned stimulus. That's my unconditioned response. What prior to today was completely neutral in that relationship? This teacher. That was the neutral stimulus in this example. As soon as you saw that person's face, that substitute teacher's face again, that person's face caused you to have the fear. Classical conditioning has occurred.